The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $75, and the loudest man in the barn laughed at him in front of the whole crowd. Silas Ward did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked at what he had bought. A great broken-down heap of an old carousel dragged out of the back of a fallen-in barn and dumped across 2 hay wagons in the middle of a farm estate sale. A whole hand-carved merry-go-round come apart at every joint. 24 wooden horses lay tumbled and cracked among the wreck of it, their carved manes split, and their painted hides gone gray and peeling. Glass jewels dropped from their trappings, legs snapped, a lead jumper with its head thrown back to the roof beams and half its face flaked bare. The center pole and the great ring gear lay seized solid with 60 years of rust, the band organ a rotted cabinet with its pipes fallen in, and the whole of it read to the crowd as a wagon-load of rotten firewood and worm-eaten ponies too far gone to save. Silas had just paid $75 to own all of it, splinters and seized gears and 24 swayback ghosts and all. It was a bright, clear Saturday morning, the kind of hard, clean light that pours across a farm lot in early fall, at an estate clearing sale on a played-out dairy place at the edge of a small lake county, back of the machinery and the milk cans, hauled out of a barn nobody had opened in a lifetime. The pieces of a little lakeside carousel that had gone dark before most of the crowd was born. Silas was 74 years old, lean and a little stooped now, but sure in the hands, with a deeply lined face, gone soft and weathered, close-cropped white hair under a flat cap, wire spectacles pushed up his nose, and pale, patient eyes that took their time. His hands were broad and careful, the fingers still steady the way a man stays steady when he has spent a life shaping soft things and mending hard ones. He had come up in the trade in his young years, a carny mechanic and a carver both, the man a park sent for when a merry-go-round threw a crank or a jumper cracked a leg. Until the little parks closed and the traveling shows sold their rides for scrap, and the men who could carve a horse by hand and time a carousel by ear were quietly let go. He made his living since as a picker, but the wood and the paint and the turning never left him. The man who laughed was Roy Bevins, who ran the biggest amusement-and-salvage supply outfit in 3 counties. A heavy-set man of about 55 in a loud checkered sport coat he wore to be seen in, his face clean-shaven and ruddy, a thick gold ring on one hand and a fat unlit cigar in the other. $75, Roy said, loud, so the whole barn could hear it. $75 for a busted merry-go-round that don't turn, don't play, and won't ever do either one again. The gears are rusted shut, the ponies are cracked to kindling, and half these horses don't have 4 legs between 2 of them. You can't run it, you can't sell it, and it'd take a fortune just to stand it up. You didn't buy a carousel old-timer, you bought a hay wagon full of rotten firewood and swayback ghosts, and you paid $75 to haul home a woodpile I'd have run through the chipper for free. He coined the name right there, loud enough to carry the merry-go-round to nowhere, and it stuck for the rest of that month, because a heap of broken painted horses that would never turn again did look like nothing so much as a ride that had quit going anyplace. The crowd laughed because Roy laughed, the way a crowd does. Silas stood through it without a change in his face, his hands folded quiet in front of him, and let the laughter pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world used when it needed something and forgot the rest of the time, then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe, because the people who stay for stories like Silas's are who Iron Hook Stories was built for. Silas said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What Roy Bevins could not have known, grinning behind his cigar, was that Silas had stood over that broken heap with a lifetime of the carousel trade awake in him. The crowd saw a wagonload of firewood. Silas saw the carving under the gray, flaking paint, the deep, true cuts of a real carver's hand and not the shallow stamp of a factory blank, the swept manes and the flared nostrils and the muscle worked into the wood, the outer sides of the horses carved rich and fine the way the old shops only ever carved the side that faced the crowd. Most of the herd were honest country shop horses, plain and sound. But one of them stopped him cold, the big lead jumper off the outside row, its head thrown clean back to the sky in the rare pose the old carvers called a stargazer, its romance side carved with a depth and a fire that no country shop had ever put in wood. And Silas knew that the great old carvers cut their marks down deep in the wood where coat after coat of cheap park paint would bury them, so that only another carver, stripping a horse clean to bare wood, would ever find the name. What he uncovered over the months that followed would put a forgotten master's name back on a record that had lost it for good. Silas had come up hard. He went on to the midways young, apprentice to an old carver and mechanic who ran the flying horses at a lakeside park, learning the gouge and the gilding and the long, patient feel of a machine until a dead carousel came alive and turned true and even under the hand. He and his wife, Ada, had run a little carousel of their own for 30 years at a lakeside grove. Silas keeping the horses carved and the gears timed, Ada in the ticket booth with the music and the lights, until the grove closed and the ride was sold off piece by piece, and they went home to a quiet they never quite filled. Ada had died after a long illness, and they had buried no family of their own, and after she was gone he lived alone in a small house behind his old shed with his rows of tools and his quiet. The town had a use for his hauling and no use at all for his hands. He knew that. A man who had spent his life keeping carousels turning could no more walk past a hand carved one going for firewood than walk past his own life, so he bid, because he had seen under the ruin the one horse that did not belong. If you've made it this far into Silas Ward's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the rest of the estate first, the milk cans and the hand tools and the boxes of harness knocked down to the pickers, while Silas waited by the hay wagons beside his broken herd. When the auctioneer finally came to the carousel and called for a bid, Roy glanced over, called out his joke, and not one other hand went up. Silas raised one finger, and the gavel came down at $75. He paid cash, signed the slip, and arranged to bring a flatbed and a couple of strong backs around at the end of the day, because a carousel, even in pieces, is a great deal of machine to move, and every splintered horse had to be crated and carried like something that could still be broken. The story got around the town before Silas's trailer was off the county road. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him outside the filling station to ask, grinning, whether he meant to charge a nickel a ride on his wood pile once he got the ghosts to gallop. Merle Tibbetts, who ran the hardware counter, said it plainer, that there was nothing left in a rotted carousel but splinters and heartbreak and a winter's worth of kindling, and no work left alive in it to raise. Silas was buying paint stripper and fine gouges, a book of gold leaf and a can of gilding size, tubes of the old jewel colors, glass cabochons for the dropped jewels, and a case of penetrating oil for the seized gears, and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent a life learning that a horse is either a carver's or it isn't, and the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which. But Silas did not go tearing into it in the daylight, with the picker's truck still on the road and Roy holding court down at the sale barn. He waited until he had every piece home and laid out on clean sawhorses in his shed, and then he went at it the slow way. Alone, over the fall and the long winter that followed, the way a man goes at anything a careful hand once made and time has nearly taken back. He did not rush. He knew a carousel keeps its truth down deep under the paint and the rust, and that you reach those places slowly. He freed the great ring gear and the cranking rods a quarter turn at a time until the seized machine moved again under his hand, trued the center pole and rebuilt the sweeps, and pieced the rotted band organ back together pipe by pipe until it could hold a note. And he brought the horses back one at a time, steaming the splits closed, re-carving a snapped leg or a broken ear to match its mate so you could not find the joint, laying fresh gesso and the old jewel colors, coat by coat, setting new glass cabochons where the jewels had dropped, and laying gold leaf back down until the trappings burned again the way they had the day they left the shop. It was the lead jumper, the stargazer off the outside row, that he saved for last and carried the longest, and it was the stargazer that gave the whole thing up. He stripped it down to bare wood a careful inch at a time, and where the crowd would have thrown it on the fire he found instead the reason he had bid. Under a dozen coats of cheap park paint, the carving came up clean and astonishing, the muscle and the wind in it, the deep-cut romance side. The trappings worked with the finest no country shop ever bothered with, all of it the hand of a master and not a shop hand. And down under the last coat, cut deep into the wood at the base of the flung-back neck, where paint after paint had buried it for 60 years, Silas's rag came away from a name. There, carved into the horse itself, where only a carver stripping it clean would ever reach, was the master's own cut mark, a carver's signature and the year, sunk into the wood by the hand that made it, and beside it, so small he nearly missed it, a tiny carved cameo of a woman's face worked into the swept mane. The little hidden portrait the old carvers sometimes left on the romance side, for no eye but their own. Down at the filling station they were still asking when the ghost would gallop. Silas set down his rag and sat very still, because he knew the name in the wood, and he knew what it meant that it was here. The horse had its own long, hard history, and the town had let it go for firewood without once asking after it. It ran back to the golden age of the American carousel, when the great carving shops in the eastern cities filled the parks with hand-carved menageries, and immigrant masters who had crossed and ocean-carved horses so fine that people came to the parks as much to look as to ride. One of the greatest of them was a man named Anton Merrick, who had come over young and learned the trade in the big shops and then carved on his own. A self-taught master of no great fame in his time, spoken of quietly among carousel people as one of the finest hands who ever set gouge to basswood, his signed figures half legend because so few were known to survive. This stargazer was his, the lead horse he had carved for the grand carousel at a lakeside park, the one figure he had put everything he knew into, the little hidden face in the mane, the one liberty he took in a life of carving to another man's order. But the Parks died in the hard years, and worse than dying, in the collector years that came after, the finest old carousels were found to be worth more in pieces than whole, and so the great machines were broken up, their horses pried off, and sold one at a time to buyers who wanted a single fine figure for a wall, and carousels that had turned for generations were destroyed for their parts. Merrick's grand carousel was scattered like that, and he died poor and forgotten, and his lead horse, his masterpiece, his hidden face and all, drifted down through the junk trade, until some country park bought it cheap to fill an empty pole, and it turned out its years unknown among plain shop horses until it came apart in a barn and went to a farm sale for $75. Silas took a rubbing of the cut mark and a roll of photographs to a Carousel Museum and Preservation Society, to people who kept the record of the old shops and the few surviving signed figures, and watched the room go quiet when they read the name. The curator, a woman long among the painted horses, went very still over the rubbing and said that a documented, signed lead jumper by that master, a stargazer of all the rare poses, with his hidden mark and the little carved face intact, was a thing the field had counted as lost, the kind of figure that turns up once in a lifetime, if it turns up at all. The finest signed master's jumpers, she told him plainly, had brought sums past $100,000 at auction. A single horse off one lost lakeside grand carousel had sold years back for $121,000, and this was its equal. Silas sat with that a while. The merry-go-round to nowhere that the barn had laughed at for a month held in its lead horse alone. A small fortune, and worth more than the money, the last signed masterpiece of a master the record had lost, still carrying the one face he had hidden for himself. The next morning Silas did not call a collector, and did not pry the stargazer off its pole to sell it away for the wall of a man with $100,000, and did not break the carousel up for the parts that would have brought far more than the whole ever could, and a few in town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. He had spent one whole month being the man who paid $75 for a woodpile, and he did not mind being thought a fool by people who had never once been right about the thing in front of them. Breaking a carousel up for its horses was the very thing that had killed the master's grand machine and 100 like it, and Silas had spent his life on the other side of that, keeping the things whole and turning, and there was no truth in doing to this one what the collector years had done to its kind. So he did the harder thing. He set himself to see the master's name written back onto the record where it belonged, and the signed stargazer documented and kept on the carousel it had ridden all these years instead of cut off and sold away, and he went looking for whatever family the carver had left, because a man ought to know when his grandfather's lost masterpiece has come turning back into the light. Anton Merrick had a granddaughter living yet, a gray woman in a mill town 2 states over, who had grown up on a scrap of family talk that some old grandfather had carved the horses for the Parks and lost every one of them when the Parks went down, a story the family told as an old sadness and mostly let go. Silas went to her that spring with the photographs and the rubbing of the cut mark, and a close picture of the little carved face hidden in the mane, and watched her look a long time at the last of it. She put a hand flat on the table and went quiet. They had grown up believing their grandfather's whole life's work was gone, burned in a park fire or scattered past finding, and here was his masterpiece come back whole. His signed lead horse and the one small liberty he had allowed himself, the little hidden face that she knew without being told, was her own grandmother's. She asked Silas why he had troubled to come so far to give a stranger back a name. He said only that a carver cuts his mark down deep where the paint will bury it because he needs to believe that somebody, some day, will strip the horse clean and find him, so that being forgotten can never be the same as never having carved the horse at all, and that he had nobody of his own to leave a thing to, and had rather leave a master his name back. There was one thing more Silas did before the carousel left his shed, and he did it for the master and for Ada and for no one else. He finished it, set every horse back on its pole in its right place on the platform, the stargazer leading the outside row where Merrick had carved it to lead, hung the sweeps and timed the cranks and coaxed the rebuilt band organ back to its music. So on the last night, with the museum's people coming in the morning, Silas set the belt and threw the switch and stood back. And the whole carousel came around, the horses rising and falling on their cranks, and the gold leaf burning under the shed lights, and the band organ playing out into the dark, the first full turn the machine had made in 60 years, the stargazer sweeping past with its head flung back to the sky, and the little hidden face turning by in the main. Then he stilled it and let it go quiet again. That part was never the point. He had made it whole again so that the man who carved it and the life it had carried would be seen one time by somebody who finally understood what they were. That summer, the carousel went where it belonged, set up under a new roof at the Carousel Museum and Preservation Society, with the master's name read clear at last, and his signed stargazer named beside it as the finest figure the society had, kept whole and turning, not cut down and sold off, so that a machine that had been broken and scattered and laughed at came around again in one piece for anybody who cared to watch. Anton Merrick's name went back onto the record of the old carving shops it had been dropped from, generations late, so the family that had thought his whole life's work lost knew at last that his masterpiece had come home. Word of it went around the town the same as the laughter had, only quieter. And the people who had called Silas a fool let the name the merry-go-round to nowhere drop and did not pick it up again. Roy Bevins was not run out of business and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he never bothered to look at close, and the next time he held court down at the sale barn the others did not lean in so far. Being right was the whole of what Silas had wanted, and it had brought a great forgotten carver's name back out of 60 years of park paint. They kept the carousel turning where the town could come and see it, the horses cleaned, and their jewels reset, and their gold leaf laid down bright, and a card beside it telling how a master's lost masterpiece had ridden 60 years unknown among country ponies, until an old man paid $75 for the ruin of it and gave it back its name. And on a still evening that next fall, the light going gold through the tall windows, Silas Ward drove over to look in on it. And there in the last of the sun the carousel came around, whole and cleaned and playing, the gold leaf burning and the stargazer sweeping past with its head to the sky. Silas was 74 years old, a man the auction had laughed at one whole month. And he stood quiet a long moment and laid one broad-scarred hand flat on the cool carved neck of the lead horse as it came by and nodded once, the way a man nods at a job that was done right. The little face turned by in the mane. The work had set it for him the way work always did. A master cuts his name down deep in the wood the paint will bury, and hides one small face in the mane for no eye but his own, trusting that somebody will come who can strip the horse clean and read what his hands made. So that being forgotten for a lifetime can never be the same as never having carved the horse at all. And a town rarely knows what greatness was left to rot in the back of its own barn until somebody troubles to save the thing they laughed at. So I'll leave it to you. Was Silas Ward right to keep the master's jumper on the carousel and give the whole machine to a museum under the carver's name, taking none of the fortune he could have had for it? Or was that one decency too far in a world that had laughed at him for nothing? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.